It looks like there are elements of the UK looking to bring assisted dying, or otherwise known as euthanasia or MAID, as it's been covered in Canada, to the UK. It's something that I've covered recently in regards to how it's been used and abused in Canada. I'll try and get through this quickly. Promo, we've got a recent article from Simon Webb talking about how the new eugenics is flourishing in modern Britain, and that's something that is very interesting because he's mainly talking about abortion, so that's killing you before you're born, and now we're looking to add eugenics at the end of life as well. And I will try and be as sensitive about this topic as possible because I understand there are some compelling arguments towards allowing people such as the terminally ill to be able to end their life with a little bit more dignity than, say, some kind of cancerous tumour would allow them to, instead of letting them deteriorate. So I've covered this recently, as I said, in Canada with their MAID program, Medical Assistance in Dying. Go to the next one, please, thank you, where I called it Canada Goes Full Black Mirror, because what's been happening is they introduced this legislation originally back in 2016 to be able to allow those who with terminal illnesses to have a more dignified death, and they were saying very specifically and explicitly in the legislation that it was to mitigate unbearable suffering. But then that got opened up and broadened to the point where next year in March it will be allowed for people with mental illnesses, who, as far as I'm concerned, are the last sorts of people who should be considered in their right mind to make a decision like that. After all, they are mentally ill.
Yeah, your coverage in part inspired the fact that my Canadian priest did a homily against MAID and medical assisted dying on the grounds that tyrants can take control of it and off the people like the mentally ill who are most vulnerable. So it's nice to know that at least our coverage of abhorrent horrors like this is having an impact.
Yes, that is true. I did have some more information regarding this sent to me, which I think shows the kind of dystopic vision that's been foisted upon Canada, where a funeral home was offering a room for a medically assisted death during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a London, Ontario funeral home in 2020. Their owner, Paul Needham, started to receive a new kind of service request from families where they were told after a few calls, and they got more and more calls and gatherings grew. It came a frequent ask of the Northview Funeral Chapel, can you provide a quiet, comfortable room where a loved one can have a medically assisted death? Wanting to meet growing need, Needham began to offer rooms for rent at his funeral home where MAID procedures could take place. Since early 2020, Needham has provided 23 rooms for medically assisted deaths. And I get the intention that's going on here. You want to provide a calming and positive, well, not exactly positive, it's a funeral home, but a calming environment for people to be able to spend their last moments with their family. So that's nice. But there is something incredibly morbid about it.
I was going to say, do they just put them in the coffin, inject them, and just shut the lid to expedite the process?
That's the question. I've described this as a fast food funeral because they just want as quick a turnaround as possible. He said a lot of times the families were in a bind. They wanted a procedure, but they had no place to go. Nobody was willing to accommodate them due to the shutdown. Sometimes they'd say things like, every time I look at the bed or every time I walk into that room, I would be reliving it. I think they just felt that there would be a stigma there afterward, and they wanted to avoid that. So quotes like that make me think that this is sort of a purely for convenience thing on the perspective of some of these families who don't want to have to walk past a loved one's former bedroom and have those memories. But at the end of the day, the passing of somebody's life is more for them than you, because you want to make sure that they have a peaceful end rather than you just get to have the convenience of not thinking about them in that condition. Yeah. But if this is something that did help a few people, well, then that's its own thing. But as I mentioned, they're looking to try and bring this kind of assisted dying program to the UK, and while it does have good intentions, I do have a lot of worries about it purely because of the way that it has been abused in Canada, where we've heard stories of people in the medical profession, in the medical industry, basically coercing certain patients who would not otherwise qualify for this procedure, where they've been coerced into taking it or been pressured into it, or they've expanded even before the legislation expanded in 2020. They expanded the ideas of what was unbearable suffering to meet the requirements for people who definitely did not want to go ahead with the euthanasia program. So this is what I'm talking about here. The assisted dying bill, which has gone through 2 readings at the moment, is being passed in the House of Lords, has been put forward by a woman called Baroness, let me just double check this, Baroness Meacher, who is an author and I think the leader of the organisation Dignity in dying. So it's had many amendments to the bill. It was introduced in 2021. The last amendments were made in January of 2022. So it has been worked on in this last year, but I do believe since the Parliament was prorogued earlier this year, it's put a dampener on it. It's basically stopped this, so it might have to go back around the rigmarole before they can try and get it to the process to where it was before. But they are trying to introduce something like this. I got the actual page, the actual paper. This was the bill as introduced. In the next link, please, John. Yeah, the assisted dying bill as introduced, so there have been amendments made since then, but this gives kind of the overview of what the bill is trying to do. So it's enabling adults who are terminally ill to be provided at their request with specified assistance to end their own life and for connected purposes. They set out parameters for assisted dying, which is subject to the consent of the High Court Family Division pursuant to subsection 2. A person who is terminally ill may request and lawfully be provided with assistance to end his or her own life. Subsection 1 only applies if the High Court by order confirms that it is satisfied that the person A has a voluntary, clear, settled and informed wish to end his or her own life, B has made a declaration that is in effect in accordance with another section and is aged 18 and over, has the capacity to make a decision to end his or her own life, and has been ordinarily resident in England and Wales for not less than 1 year. They also set out some parameters for terminal illnesses. So there is some stuff here. So the person is terminally ill if the person has been diagnosed to be by a registered medical practitioner as having an inevitably progressive condition which cannot be reversed by a treatment, and as a consequence of that terminal illness is reasonably expected to die within 6 months. Note the lack of any notion of unbearable suffering in here. You just need to have a life expectancy of 6 months. 2, treatment which only relieves the symptoms of an inevitable progressive condition temporarily is not to be regarded as treatment which can reverse that condition. So if you've got a prognosis of 6 months and there's no sort of treatment that they can provide you that can reverse that, then you're considered to be terminally ill. And it also needs signing and counter-signing by the individual and 2 independent doctors as well. Canada showed in 2016 that it had all of this and still opened up to abuse, which is once again one of the main concerns that I have in respect to a medicine which has been prescribed for any person under subsection 1. So this is talking about how you actually administer this assisted dying. An assisting health professional may prepare the medicine for self-administration by that person, or prepare a medical device which will enable the person to self-administer the medicine, or assist the person to ingest or otherwise self-administer the medicine, but the decision to self-administer the medicine and the final act of doing so must be taken by the person for whom the medicine has been prescribed. Subsection 4 does not authorise an assisting health professional to administer a medicine to another person with the intention of causing that person's death. So that's why it's not classified as euthanasia. That's why they're calling it assisted dying, because you have to be the one to administer it to yourself, right, with the help of a medical professional who can either provide you with the drugs that you need to do it yourself or provide you with equipment if you're perhaps in a physical condition to be unable to do it yourself. Say, like, if you can't lift your arms to put a pill to your mouth or something like that. Okay. And they do have a conscientious objection here, which says a person is not under any duty, and this is more in reference to the people who would be helping these people to assist in their own deaths, whether by contract or arising from any statutory or other legal requirement to participate in anything authorised by this Act to which that person has a conscientious objection. Now, this is important because in Canada, since they introduced it in 2016, 2017, I believe I went over last Thursday that there were some cases of nurses being pushed out or just actively fired because they refused to take part in this, because I think the administration, what they introduced in the administration over there was a euthanasia. So you're the one administering the medication that's going to kill this person. You're the one having to inject that person. Some nurses did not want to do this, and I assume some doctors as well, and they were pushed out of the industry, and all of a sudden you're basically creating this mass exodus of people who are against the euthanasia scheme in Canada, which will provide room for people who are more than willing to go ahead and inject that needle and potentially end that person's suffering, potentially end that person's life prematurely because of the abuses that I covered in that.
There's a perverse financial incentive as well in government-funded healthcare to kick people out if they don't do this, because at the moment we're going through a argument where people are on the NHS waiting list endlessly. There's going to be millions of missed cancer screenings. They can't keep pace with demand because they won't lower immigration. Funding can never catch up, and lockdown has caused a delay in diagnoses. So if you bump a few people off, you'll save us some money, and the nurses and doctors that won't do that, well, you're not doing your duty to the NHS.
Yes. Once again, I think when it comes to something like this, in theory, I don't have much of an issue with the idea of somebody with terminal illness who's going to be suffering for the last 6 months or so of their lives, choosing to end it with a bit more dignity so they're not, say, having to become malnourished and go through any major physical suffering. The problem is, as has been shown in Canada, the ability for people to abuse it and to abuse the system, to force people into it. It all sounds good on paper, but how will it actually be done in practice is the question that I think Canada is showing us what goes on, although I am aware that a few other places do have, a few other countries, I think New Zealand, have assisted dying programs that haven't gone as far as Canada.
Yeah.
As I said, they've gone through the second reading in the House of Lords, but it seems to have all been paused since the proroguing. They had a full House of Lords debate on it, and there were some concerns brought up by a man right at the end of this called Lord Winston, who said, in moving my amendment, because he wanted to amend it so it would use the words euthanasia rather than assisted dying, he did end up retracting that because of the fact that it's not the doctor administering it, it's the person administering it themselves. So he said, in moving my amendment, I was fairly careful to adopt a neutral position, but one thing in this debate that remains a problem for me is how it has been assumed that it is the autonomy of the people who are dying or are likely to want to die that is at stake. The problem is that in spite of what the noble Lord Krebs and the noble and learned Lord Brown said, it is about the autonomy of a lot of other people, health service workers, carers, people in the street, people who clean hospitals, and most importantly, our society. So he's bringing up an excellent point, which is that this could change the very fundamental nature of how we view life in our society if life is something that can just be ended like that if you choose to do so, because once again there is a lot of room for legislation like this to be opened up to the mentally ill, for instance, as they're doing in Canada. As I said, this was all introduced by Baroness Meacher, who is an author and chair of Dignity in Dying. She's been a member of the House of Lords since 2009, sits as a crossbencher. In the Lords, Molly speaks primarily on health, welfare and drug policy. She also played an important role in generating support for Lord Falconer's assisted dying bill. So it seems that there is a group of people within the House of Lords who have consistently tried to put forward legislation like this. And I am not going to assume any bad motives. I read some of her speech that she gave at the beginning of the debate, and it seems that she is motivated in an altruistic and sincere way. I'm not going to do anything like this. I just don't know if we can trust a move like this being passed on to the government, mainly because after something like COVID and lockdowns, for instance, I don't know necessarily if I trust the government with much to do with people's well-being or health. And care.org had a very good article talking about a lot of the issues that they held with the assisted dying bill. So first of all, there was the philosophical issues where they put that it's called, although it's entitled assisted dying, its intention is to enable lethal medication to be prescribed so that people can kill themselves. Although in current English law, assisting someone who wishes to commit suicide is a serious criminal offence with a penalty of up to 14 years imprisonment, the underlying philosophy of the Meacher Bill, as they call it, is that there is no such thing as, is that there is such a thing as a rational and legally justified suicide. It's notable that the Meacher Bill makes no mention of suffering, as I pointed out, is not necessary for the person who wishes to kill themselves to exhibit any degree of suffering before being eligible for suicide. This is in stark contrast to similar legislation in the Netherlands, where the criterion is hopeless and unbearable suffering, or in Canada, where a person must have enduring and intolerable physical or psychological suffering that cannot be alleviated under conditions the person considers acceptable. It's immediately obvious that the underlying philosophy of the bill is deeply problematic. If the real motivation is to limit intolerable suffering, then why should limited life expectancy of less than 6 months be a rational reason for suicide, whilst unbearable suffering is not? So, because of course unbearable suffering also opens it up to the fact that you're not going to die anytime soon. You could live for 30 to 40 years, but you will be suffering to an unbearable degree, which once again in Canada was one of the things that allowed it to open up to a lot of abuse, because unbearable suffering, you could be lying about how much you're suffering, you could just be depressed, you could be suffering a lot of short-term symptoms and problems that could be alleviated through other treatments. I do also think with stuff like this, it can be a bit of a safety net for a health service, especially a socialised health service, to, instead of actually improving the services that they provide to the people who rely on it, they instead go, well, you can just kill yourself.
Yeah, just like how abortion has become a safety net for
Bloody hell.
smooth corporations to say, well, women, don't have to take time off work. You can just kill your baby. We'll even pay to transport you to and from the abortion clinic.
Yeah, there's a lot of room for abuse. They also have problems with the idea that you would be diagnosing this correctly in every case. They say the bill assumes that taking such a momentous decision to allow a person to kill themselves can be based on 2 doctors' prediction that they have less than 6 months to live. But it's well known that the medical prediction of life expectancy is extremely unreliable, especially when carried out by doctors who are not specialists in terminal care. As an experienced NHS consultant, the writer of this says, I am aware of how many examples when I and my colleagues were hopelessly wrong in predicting how many months or years a person had left to live.
You only have to think of Tammy Peterson, for example.
I've known people, for instance, I spoke to for a university project, in fact, a man who had pulmonary hypertension, which is a condition for your heart, can block a lot of the arteries leading to it, which can lead you to have massive heart problems, a heart attack and die. For instance, he was given, I think 8 years ago, he was given 5 years to live, and he was told that over that 5 years he would have increasingly detrimental health, and it would become increasingly more difficult for him to live, and yet he's still around. 8 years later, he plays in a band, he's on stage most nights, and he and his girlfriend or fiance, I don't know exactly what their relationship is at the moment, they've got a healthy little kid together. So
I know the inverse as well, of where my next door neighbour was working up until he was 73. He felt a bit stressed and ill. He went to the hospital. They found out that he had undiagnosed cancer. They said 6 months to a year, and within a week he dropped down dead.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah, so these things are very inaccurate a lot of the times. They also have worries about coercion. They say, consider an elderly person who has a great fear of being a burden to his or her loved ones and who wishes to end their life to avoid this. So this is not even necessarily something that's active coercion by family members. It could just be a pressure that you feel on yourself to not be a burden. And I have known my elderly family members to worry about being a burden on the rest of the family, and I wouldn't want them to end their life just because they feel that they're a burden to the rest of us. Is it possible that the relatives are applying subtle pressure and covert manipulation, both abuse and abandonment of elderly people, is shockingly common in our society, and that is sadly very true. How is it possible to avoid inappropriate pressure being applied to elderly and vulnerable people? Most busy doctors are simply ill-equipped and inadequately trained to detect subtle forms of social manipulation and coercion. And this is just a reminder to go and see your nan this weekend.
Yeah.
She would really appreciate it.
Take her to church. She's waiting for it.
And more worries about societal effects as well, saying that human life, like Lord Winston brought up, and society-wide resistance to suicide has been part of the glue that's bound our community together for hundreds of years. Will the existence of a specialised group of people who are authorised to plan and assist suicide under certain circumstances change attitudes to self-killing? Will rational suicide, for those who feel their life is worthless, gradually become rehabilitated and promoted as a reasonable solution, once again, as it seems to in Canada? Like I say, there are plenty of pros and cons to this. I think it is just important to recognise there is plenty of room for abuse in this, while also recognising that the pure principle of not wanting somebody to suffer in the last few months of their lives is sincere and altruistic on the point of the people who are putting this legislation forward. Excuse me. I did notice, though, in researching this, there has been a strange spate of pro-euthanasia articles that I've been finding recently that have been giving lots of people big sob stories about family members who've died in horrible ways due to, malnourishment and wasting diseases that people have experienced that are obviously horrible, but they don't really present any reasoned arguments beyond this is horrible, you wouldn't this to happen to you, would you? So there was this one from Metro, there was the next one from BBC where someone was said that they were arrested for taking someone to Dignitas, and that's a bit ridiculous if you ask me, because if the person is still in their sound mind and has asked for someone to take that, you shouldn't be arrested just for taking someone to it. But either way, and then there was this one which once again shows the kind of perverse financial incentive that some people can have. A man called Dr. Death, a scientist, wants his assisted suicide pods to be installed in the UK. The man behind the suicide pod, a 3D printed capsule that kills the occupant within 10 minutes at the push of a button, wants to bring his invention to the UK. Dr. Philip Nitschke, who's been nicknamed Dr. Death, went viral due to his creation of the Sarcopod, which promises users a painless death. So this is actual Futurama suicide pod.
Right
here.
First, mate.
I wonder if it charges you a nickel like it does in that, and if I can keep that nickel. And according to Dignity in Dying Scotland, there is no specific crime of assisting a suicide in Scotland, because it seems that Scotland also has legislation trying to push this at the same time that could be passed there. The Assisted Dying for Terminally Ill Adults Scotland, if that is passed, it would make Scotland the first country in the UK to legalise the right for a terminally ill, mentally competent person to end their life. So once again, unlike in Canada, where I was just reporting on the abuses that have happened, here there's a lot of grey area and stuff that we don't know if it is going to happen or not. I would like to highlight this, and people can make up their own minds. I, for one, am very hesitant on such a thing, purely because of the Canada being such a prominent example of how it can be abused. But you can make up your own mind there, and that's all I've got for that one.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as the premium articles we do, this one on Xi Jinping's lockdowns, with an audio track for silver and gold tier members. If you'd like to find out what else we're putting out, you can follow us on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.